Life Issues with Vicky Gibbens on UCB1.
2024, it's a record-breaking year. Millions of people around the world will be heading to the polls as part of national elections. The results will influence the stability of international relationships, economies, security, and so much more for years to come. In some places, it may appear voting is a choice, but any real dissent would be dangerous, leading only to predictable leadership selection. For other countries, the highly regarded nature of being able to make free and fair selections on ballot papers will be challenged by new and emerging threats. And what about the sovereignty of God and understanding His will and our responses when it comes to voting? I'm Vicky Gibbens, and joining us for our Life Issues, we have Danny Webster, the Director of Advocacy at the Evangelical Alliance. It's a charity made up of hundreds of organisations, thousands of churches, and tens of thousands of individuals.
Great to be with you. Thank you.
So to be clear, in this podcast, there are rules and regulations we do need to adhere to, and there's no one party political agenda being championed. But we felt it was important to consider the question, does God care about my vote? Now, Danny, you spent a lot of time now in advocacy. How did God confirm this was where you needed to be?
Well, I think I've always been a bit of a political geek. I love politics. I love the drama. I love the theatre of it. But I think the thing that for me is so important is connecting what I believe about God and what He says about humanity, but also connecting that with what's going on in the world around us. That's why for the last however many years I've been working to try and provide that bridge between helping people to understand what their Christian faith says and means and how to apply it in the world we live. And politics is one crucial area. It's not the only area, but it's one crucial area where we need to consistently and continually think through how our faith has something to say about what's going on in society. So I had a chance when I finished university to work in Parliament, to work for a Christian MP, and that was a great experience of someone who was really thinking quite seriously about how to put these issues into practice, how to work out their faith in public life. It got me thinking about it, and then working for the Evangelical Alliance, I love trying to help do this on a day-to-day basis, help churches work out how they can engage locally and nationally with what's going on, but also then how we can engage in Parliament and with the laws that are being passed and have something to say about these really crucial issues.
So if we go back to some basic Greek today, no test happening, Danny, but democracy in its simplest definition means power of the people. So we then choose who represents us in government. For it to work, we have to participate. It has to be protected. But when we look around the world, the legitimate will of the people in so-called democracies is sometimes being suppressed. Equally, some authoritarian leaders may suggest we've got it wrong in wanting a democracy. So why for you does democracy matter?
Well, I think democracy is a compromise, and I think our democratic processes are compromises. In that I think it's important that we are involved in decision making, so it is not just the voices of a few who are making the decisions about what goes on. I think if we actually look back into the Bible, into the Old Testament, you had that constant challenge between the kings and the prophets, and the kings acting as the rulers and then the prophets calling them to account. And I think that idea of accountability is really crucial, that earthly leaders aren't able to do just what they want to do, that they are held to account by people who are affected by their decisions. So I think democracy has its roots in Christian teaching. I don't think particular political systems or voting systems or processes, I don't think any of those have any particular Christian element. I think there are ideas and strands that we can draw to say, well, how can we involve people in decision making? How can we ensure that people are involved? How can we ensure that those in power are held accountable? But as I say, it's a compromise because we can't all be involved in every single decision that's being made. That would just be ridiculous. It would lead to no decisions ever being made. So we do have to have, what we have is representative democracy. So we vote for people who represent us in Parliament, and they make the decisions on a day-by-day basis, but they are accountable to those people who voted them in. So sometime, probably in the autumn of 2024, we will have an election and we will have our chance to have our say on what those people did. So I think democracy is a really important thing. It's not perfect. We consistently need to be scrutinizing it and holding it to account in the same way that we hold our politicians to account. But I think it is vital, as it's a way that it gives us a chance of having a say in how the country is run.
Most years in the UK, we see some kind of election. The general election is the big one, if you like, for many of us. So if we get back to basics for a moment, when do they happen? Who can vote?
Well, a UK general election has to happen at least every 5 years. The last election happened at the end of 2019. So 5 years after Parliament first sat, there has to be another general election. That puts the very, very final date at sometime in January 2025. I don't think anyone expects the vote to be in January or around Christmas. So I think that's where people are assuming. Now, it's not going to be in May, that we're looking at an October or November election as the most likely, but it is up to technically the King, but the Prime Minister asks the King to dissolve Parliament and call a general election. It is at their decision when exactly it takes place. The law's changed a bit about that, in that for a couple of elections, it was set at exactly 5 years. So there was some predictability about when the date has been. But we don't know the exact date. We just know it has to be within this time frame.
Now, you've already started to helpfully biblically reflect for us today, but in the time we have, we can't really bring the depth of history of the relationship between the church and the state in the UK. But suffice to say, there has been and continues to be one. So the perspective that Christianity and politics don't mix isn't accurate, although whether they should mix or not is something we're going to be discussing more in detail today. You've been doing some research with evangelicals. Let's start by explaining that term, because beyond the UK, evangelicals may be a term which some would expect a political lean in a certain direction.
Yes, and so I work for the Evangelical Alliance, and when we think about evangelicals in the UK, there are generally 4 core characteristics we recognise. One is that they hold the Bible as the authoritative word of God, and that affects their decisions. The second is the centrality of the cross to their faith. The third is a personal conversion experience, and the fourth is a faith that is active and makes a difference. So that's like a fourfold way of thinking about evangelicals. It's not a political category, and that is one of the things that is quite different to how it is often seen in the US, where evangelical is often a more cultural and political label. It is theological as well in the States, but often it is associated in a particular political way in the US that we don't have those same associations in the UK.
So briefly, how has this research come together, and what was the aim behind some of the questions you've been asking?
We wanted to find out what evangelicals in the UK thought, how they think politically, how they acted politically. We did some research ahead of the 2015 general election, so nearly 10 years ago. And we wanted to update that, ask some of the same questions, some new questions, to find out what evangelicals think. So we surveyed 1,380 evangelical Christians at the end of 2023. And it was fascinating just to see the way that they are involved. There is a significant desire to be politically engaged among evangelicals, but there is real diversity in how they're engaged. There's no one way that evangelicals think politically. They vote for different parties. They think different party leaders would be the best prime minister. They think different policy areas are the most important. Different policy ideas would affect how they vote. So there is that great diversity. I think there's also a lot of uncertainty. We see up to a quarter of evangelicals haven't decided how they'll vote. So there is a lot of those votes that are up for grabs. And there are others who have decided how they vote, but are voting tactically, or would say that they are voting differently to how they voted in previous elections. And so what we see from the research is a really wide picture of how evangelicals are engaged. They really care. For 58% of evangelicals, they say what a party does that will affect the most vulnerable in society is the most important factor in deciding how they vote. So evangelicals are motivated by how politics helps those who are in greatest need in society. And that's a real encouragement. It's something that motivates us in how we represent evangelicals, how we engage with politicians around that. So we see this diversity, but we also see in churches a lot of hesitation and uncertainty about how to engage in politics. They talk about some of the issues, some of the big news stories we've seen in recent years. That gets talked about in church, whether that's poverty in the UK, war and peace overseas. But a lot of policy areas that Christians may take very seriously, church leaders just don't know how to talk about them. So we hear far less in churches around them. And then there's real hesitancy about how to engage ahead of an election. And we want to give churches an encouragement and the resources to help them to pray for politics, but also to be informed and to be engaged ahead of that vote at some point later this year.
It's really encouraging to hear that engagement, political engagement from evangelicals. Down the decades, there have always been political scandals. Politics involves humans and power, and it feels like there's a certain inevitability to it. However, I guess the reach of how we communicate and share information has never been greater. Do you think that feeds into the distrust that we still see among evangelicals when it comes to politics?
So we found that only 12% of evangelicals trust politicians. And remarkably, that's actually higher than the general public. That wasn't really a surprise. It's very low. I think it's concerningly low, but it wasn't really a surprise because politicians are not well trusted in society. They are seen as being in it for themselves. So we weren't surprised to see that, but it does provoke a really significant challenge because I think we want to see greater engagement in politics, but for that engagement to be meaningful, there has to be trust rebuilt. And we have to work at how we can build trust between the population and the politicians so that politicians are and are seen to be working for the good of all people. I don't think you can just put a new screen up, some new wallpaper up and pretend everything's okay. I think you actually have to change some of the situations at the root. So you can't just pretend everything's okay. So I think we do have to work at rebuilding that trust, and that comes over the long term with politicians demonstrating integrity, demonstrating that they are people who can be trusted, that they do the things that they say that they will do. And you can't shortcut that. You can't just pretend that exists where it doesn't exist. But I think that's an area where Christians need to get involved and where we hopefully can play a role in rebuilding some of that trust and rebuilding that connection, because it's absolutely vital. If you don't have the trust in the politicians, you don't have the trust in the decisions that they make or the institutions that play such a crucial role in our life. And if there's that disconnect, if people aren't trusting decisions that are being made and institutions that hold authority in our lives, then actually that leads to a serious disconnect in our society. And that's one that I think we are seeing some of the consequences of. And I think we want to try and heal some of those divides and bring some of those things together. And I think our involvement is a really crucial step in that.
Because there'll be more than 600 MPs who are elected, many, many more candidates, obviously, on the ballot paper for people to be considering, and not all of them will be Christians. So how do we go about building those relationships then?
So I think elections are a great opportunity to build a relationship. I think elections are a short period. The campaign is short. The voting is one day. So I wouldn't want to put too much importance on a very narrow event. But I think they provide an opportunity for churches and individual Christians to connect with politicians. the politicians are looking for your vote, and they are looking to engage with communities of people in their constituency. Churches have often held hustings for local candidates, and I think that's one thing they can do in the run-up to the next election, where candidates are invited to come together. It might be one church, it might be a group of churches in the constituency, and they will answer questions from the community. I think it's also an opportunity for churches to say a little bit about what they do in communities. So it's not just about questioning the candidates, but also providing a place of information for candidates about this is who we are. This is what we bring to your community. This is why we're people who you want to be building relationships with and paying attention to. So I think hustings are a great place to start. But we don't want to just be there when they're after our vote. I think we need to build the relationships once they've been elected. But actually, if you hold the hustings, if you invite them to that, congratulate whoever's elected, whether it's the person you voted for or not, congratulate them, thank them, invite them to church. It might be to a church service. It might be like if we've got an election in November, there might be a carol service just around the corner to invite your new MP to, but also just seek to build that relationship. Seek to demonstrate to them what a difference the Christian faith makes, both spiritually and socially, to our society. So we are showing how the Christian faith changes people's lives, but we're also showing how it motivates us to make a difference to all of society. So that's why I think elections are a really good starting point, because they provide an opportunity for that year-round, long-term relationship between politicians and local churches.
Your research did highlight there is a bit of a gap, isn't there, in terms of how far churches will go in being willing to hold a husting. As you suggested there, inviting your MP to a church service. What do you think are the barriers as to why perhaps church leaders aren't willing to do that? Do you think they may be fearful of being criticised for politically influencing their congregations?
I think some churches may have fear of politically influencing a congregation. I think sometimes it's just practicalities and logistics. Hustings need to be organised at late notice. We don't know when the election's coming. So probably at some point, I'm guessing September, but that is just a guess, an election will be announced. And then for church, you're like, oh, we've got 3 weeks to organise a husting. So there are just some practical logistical issues. But we'll be providing some resources ahead of the election to help churches to do some of that. But politicians are working on the same short time scale. So it's not like they have more notice of when the election's going to be. In fact, I think there are probably a very small number of politicians who have any idea exactly when the election will be. So I think there are practical issues. I think there are concerns about not wanting to engage in polarised political debates. And that's understandable. I think it is understandable that politics can be something that divides communities and divides congregations. But I think recognising that division is a useful place to start. Recognising that people in the congregation will vote for different parties, will have different political priorities. Here's a way where we can seek to serve that and to help people to think faithfully about politics and to think about what their faith has to say about politics is something that I think churches can do. They're not going to be telling people all the answers of this is the right way to think politically, but encouraging people to think about it and to engage with it is somewhere where I think churches can step in. But I think that hesitancy is a reason why they don't always do as much as they can. And I think ahead of an election, ourselves and other Christian organisations will be producing resources to help churches on the practicalities, but also to think through some of these issues. And I think that's a good opportunity. And I'd love to see, if we do this survey again, to see many more churches more engaged ahead of the vote.
You're listening to Life Issues. Our guest is Danny Webster. He's the Director of Advocacy at the Evangelical Alliance. I want you to come back to a phrase you just used there about political polarisation and talk a bit about manifestos as well, because what about how we learn about ideas that could make future policies and legislation and how money is going to be spent, how we're finding this information out, because we live in a world full of algorithms creating echo chambers, greater political polarisation. Do manifestos still, do you think, have the kind of impact they once did when politicians are creating these short videos on social media platforms now?
I think manifestos do matter. But I think they matter more for understanding what are going to be the priorities of a government when they come into power. I think for individuals trying to decide what the parties are saying, the manifestos come very late in the day. They often will be published 2 or 3 weeks before polling day. So even after an election's called, the manifestos aren't published straight away. And the reason why they do that is because they want to stay flexible for as long as possible. They don't want to actually make those 100% final decisions until they really have to. So manifestos matter, but so much of the political narrative of what parties are standing for and what they're saying comes before the manifestos and will run on beyond it. So it does matter what goes into a party's manifesto. And it was interesting from our research finding out, well, what kind of commitments would make a difference? If I'm honest, I think people were optimistic about how different manifesto policy commitments would make a difference. In many cases, we don't have that opportunity. The parties don't provide us with a clear cut. If you vote this way, you'll get that. If you vote this way, you'll get the other. Often it is much more difficult. Parties seek to appeal to the greatest number of people. So they'll have a bit in a manifesto that appeals to one group and a bit in a manifesto that appeals to another group. But then the opposite's true too. There'll be things in the manifesto that you don't particularly like. And that's where making a decision is challenging, because we won't always, in fact, we will never agree with everything that a party stands for. But I think there is a call for us to use our discernment to make decisions about how to use our votes faithfully. So I think manifestos matter, and I think we should be paying attention to them. But I'm not naive about how many people will read a party manifesto. I actually have a stash of them. This is part of my political confession, perhaps, that I have a stash of old party manifestos that I've got from previous elections, because I actually go out and buy them when they're produced. Because I like to read them, but also because it's political memorabilia. I know that I am very unusual in doing that. Most people do not go to that extent. They don't go onto the website and read the manifestos that are available. They might, if they're lucky, read a news summary of what the manifestos are saying. So it all gets filtered out through the media. And we then need to use our judgment in how we consume media, because if that's how we're going to learn what the parties are saying, then we need to use our discernment in how things are being reported. So if we just read one newspaper, perhaps read another newspaper to give a different perspective in what politicians are saying. So we're not just getting the same story all the time with the same potential political bias, but we are hearing from a range of sources what's being said. So I think the manifestos matter, but so too does the media that kind of conveys the messages of the manifesto. That's really important as well. And that's where we need to also use our discernment in how we engage with that and consume that.
And how savvy, how concerned should we be when we think about some of the manipulation, the misinformation? We've heard claims of hacking already, and I guess how artificial intelligence is being used to influence not only the media and the way that information is being disseminated, but also the political campaigning. I
think we need to be aware of it. I think for most of us, we struggle to understand and engage with exactly how it's going to work out in practice. But to take a very simple example, social media sites work on algorithms, and the more you click on something, the more of something that you get. I know that. And sometimes I'm like, oh, I better not click on that, otherwise I'm just going to get flooded with more things from that. So I think we need to be aware of how that's affecting us. And I think that does run the risk of pushing us into silos. So if we're always hearing the same sorts of voices, and political parties will target adverts to people with particular interests and particular habits. So they know that if you're watching certain videos on YouTube, actually that's something you're interested in. So then they're going to send you a particular advert that might appeal to you. So we need to know about how that's operating and be aware of that. But I think part of that is just, we can't ignore it. We can't ignore that happens, that we are targeted with advertising. And I think there is a fine line between targeting and manipulation. Like, adverts target people. We need to be really aware of that. how we are affected by that is sometimes our responsibility as well. We need to take responsibility for what we're consuming and how it's affecting us. And I think part of that is making sure that we're talking to people. We're not just having it get sucked into an online conversation or being a passive consumer. We're actually talking about things, because sometimes when we talk to our friends and our family about things, they have different views. And that can be really healthy to understand how people with different views approach issues. So I think that is one crucial counterweight, is just making the time to talk about it. And I think there may be a place for churches to, again, not have the answers, but to provide the forums for people to talk about issues that they're thinking about. And actually, I think that could be something where churches serve the wider community as well as their congregation.
Danny, earlier you recapped for us some of the priority issues that have been found in the research that you've done, talking about poverty coming top, thinking about how for many of us our vote isn't just about ourselves, it very much is about our neighbour as well. One thing I wanted to come back to, which was interesting, was actually how free speech is also a priority for many of us. Perhaps within wider society, not much consideration is given to religious freedom and tolerance.
Yes, it's interesting that there were two areas that we asked questions about that were relevant to religious freedom and freedom of speech, and both of them demonstrated really high levels of support. The first was around freedom of speech in the workplace, about deeply held religious beliefs. 87% said that a commitment to freedom of speech in the workplace would encourage them would make them more likely to vote for a particular party. And that's encouraging. I think it shows that there is a felt need here, that people do feel that speaking about what they believe in a secular workplace is challenging and difficult. I think we've seen stories of people who have got into trouble over this. And for many people, even if they haven't encountered trouble themselves, they're aware of some of the pressures that they might feel. So I think there is a real felt need here. And I think it's something that we would want politicians to pay attention to, and to ensure that workplaces are somewhere where people can be open about their faith and just able to talk about what they believe and what that means. But then the other area was about the prioritization of freedom of religion and belief overseas. Because when I talk about the challenge of Christians in the UK, I always want to be a bit hesitant, because actually the Christians in other parts of the world suffer in really significant ways for what they believe and for practicing what they believe. And I don't want to compare our experience in the UK to that, because I think there is a need for us to continue to prioritize and to call attention to the way that Christians are persecuted, the way that Christians suffer for their faith, for choosing to worship, for converting to Christianity. And I think that is something that we see evangelicals really keen to see our government pay attention to. So we asked two questions. Do we want it prioritised? Yes, evangelicals want it prioritised and would vote for parties that prioritise it. But they would also vote for parties that made protecting religious freedom a factor in trade arrangements. So we were involved in a lot of trade arrangements at the moment, post-Brexit. Actually, how are we using that leverage to encourage freedom of religion and belief in countries all around the world? So we found that really encouraging, and that's part of what we will be saying to politicians from this research, of these are the things that evangelicals care about and want to see.
You've mentioned a number of ways beyond just using our vote that we can be engaging with politics in the UK. I just wonder about those who are Christians, who are representing the electorate as well, because in recent years we've heard, how their freedom of speech perhaps has been restricted, or they felt they've had to make compromises. Some saying felt the pressure of making certain things more palatable or politically correct. Others saying they felt torn between living as a faithful Christian and serving as a political leader. Those kind of examples that we've seen, doesn't that put off people from entering the sphere of politics?
The research demonstrated a really complicated picture of Christianity in public life. There was a clear desire to see Christians involved. 93% of respondents felt it was important for more Christians to be involved in public life. But there were also a real recognition that how that happens is difficult. So many people felt that the political parties, so 64% said that the current political parties discourage me from becoming more engaged in politics. So yes, we need more Christian engagement, but the current vehicles for doing that are one of the main factors that put us off. And there was also different answers around how Christian beliefs should be reflected in the law. So biblical values was a high priority in determining how someone votes, but we see that people vote differently. So people want to see biblical values in public life, but they see that outworked differently. So I think we do want to see greater engagement among Christians, and we do want to encourage those Christians who are already engaged. We want to provide support for them and prayer for them, and I think that's really vital. And recognizing that we won't always agree with exactly how they vote and what they say on particular political issues. I think it's reasonable for us to challenge them sometimes on that. I think that again, that's part of being in a democratic system, that as individuals, but also as Christians in a corporate sense, it's reasonable to challenge politicians about how they are interpreting what they believe and putting it into practice. But that challenge should never take on the place of undermining their role in public life. And I think we need to have a lot of grace for people who make incredibly difficult decisions on a regular basis in terms of what legislation to pass and decisions on how to run the country.
Now, you've been looking at some fascinating perceptions we have of Jesus as well, which we're going to get onto. Just thinking biblically, of course, the Messiah, Jesus, not a political radical revolutionary to overthrow the Roman Empire and end the oppression that many hoped for. What kind of questions were you asking around Jesus?
Well, we had. Is it fair to say that I don't know if it's an appropriate thing to say we had fun with research, but I have fun with research. I find research fun. I'm getting all my geeky confessions out today. We asked people how Jesus would vote, what he would do, would he go to jail? 42% of evangelical respondents said that Jesus would go to jail if he was alive today. We didn't ask the follow-up to find out what he would be sent to jail for. But what was interesting was 76% said he would befriend politicians of all parties. And that's a high stat, but it does also raise the question of, well, what about the 24%? 24% actually, do they think that Jesus wouldn't befriend politicians of all parties? I think there's a challenge there for how we view Jesus, because I would hope that number would have been even higher. There was more than half, 56%, said that Jesus would use his vote, but then when we actually drilled into which party he would vote for, fewer than 8% actually gave an answer to that. So most people thought he would use his vote, but weren't confident saying that he would vote for a particular political party in our UK system. And when we were reflecting on these results, they're kind of a bit unfair because we just don't know how Jesus would operate if he was in our current political system. I think it's important to recognize the political consequences of Jesus' kingdom message, that it wasn't just about personal salvation, but it was about the coming of the kingdom of God that would affect all things, that would see all things reconciled to him. So I think we need to have that wide vision that politics is within the realm of God's care and Jesus' work. But we really don't have the specifics on what that means in practice. I think voting is an important outworking of the system we're in, but it's so far away from the system that was in place 2,000 years ago that trying to say whether or not or how Jesus would vote is just an impossible question. It's good. It's kind of fun to think about, but I don't think we should get too hung up on it. And likewise, would Jesus be sent to jail? Well, we know that Jesus pushed the boundaries in his day. And I think we should be interested in how that works out in our society when we seek to follow Jesus. Where is there a call on us to live in a radical way that might push some of the boundaries in our society?
Picking up on that point, because as you reflected at the start, we obviously respect God's sovereignty, and that can sometimes be a challenge to the infrastructures we have in society, what democracy actually looks like. And there was a willingness in the research, actually, as you just described there, to sometimes push the boundaries if that is necessary with the laws and the legislation that we have in the land when it comes to compromising our faith and belief in Jesus.
Yeah, this was another area where we had some research regret, I would say, because we asked people, well, 77% said that there are some issues where it is right for Christians to resist or disobey the law. That's really significant, but we didn't ask them what those issues would be. And I think it is reasonable to say that actually, if someone's going, a lot of Christians would say that if a law is going to stop me from practicing my faith, I'm going to disobey that law. If it's going to stop me from worshipping or praying or living out my faith, I will disobey it. But the practical outworking is really challenging. How Christians respond in contexts where they are severely restricted in how they operate will vary. And when I've spoken to Christians who live in regimes where practicing their faith is something that puts their life at risk, they take different approaches. For some, they meet in secret. For others, they do meet more boldly in public and risk arrest. Different Christians will take different approaches and work that out. But I think it is a reminder to think, actually, yes, some people suffer significantly for their faith. And where and how can we be bold in following Jesus in our day-to-day lives?
Danny, to recap, you've talked about building solid relationships with those MPs, with candidates in our local communities. We've looked at the need to understand key issues that are shaping policy and legislation in the future. Where does prayer and the importance of prayer fit into this?
I think prayer should be pretty much our starting point when it comes to engaging and thinking about politics. I think it is the thing that every church across the UK can do ahead of the election. I think we are called to pray for people who are in authority. And I think we should do that. We should do that whether we agree with their politics or not. We should do that because we know that if we think on a church level, there will be people in our congregations that vote for them and who vote against them. And we shouldn't show preference in who we are praying for. We should pray for our political leaders. And we should pray that they govern in wisdom and with grace. And I think that it's important that we are then informed about how we pray. So it's important to pray, full stop. It's also important to ensure that we are informed about the key issues that will then help motivate our prayer and inform us as we seek to pray. So I think that's something that churches should be doing. It's something that individual Christians should be doing. It's something that we, as the Evangelical Alliance, will most certainly be doing in the run-up to the election. And I think that's something that even if churches are hesitant or unsure about how else they can engage, let's make sure that we are praying, because that is the one thing that we can all do that we have that's really distinct and really different to others. And I think if prayer is our only contribution to this general election, it is a really valuable contribution that we can make. The elections are a really crucial opportunity to engage. They're not the answer to everything. They're a one day in an election cycle chance to think a bit more. It's a chance for churches to pay a bit more attention to politics. But I think if churches are thinking about how they can engage, I would say pray. Make sure we're praying. Make sure we are informed and equipped around the issues that are at hand in the election, and then build relationships with politicians. Start that as soon as you can, as soon as you know who's running for election in your seat. Many of the parties have already selected candidates in many seats across the UK, so you'll already be able to start building those relationships. When it's election time, hold a husting, involve the community in that decision. Hear from your church and your community about what are the crucial issues, and then use that as a platform to build that relationship. And I think actually that helps us as Christians in the UK to have a connection with people who are in Parliament. I think the work that I do and my colleagues at the Evangelical Alliance do is strengthened by knowing that churches are building relationships with politicians in every constituency around the UK. And so I don't think it's an either or. I think it's both what's happening locally and what's happening nationally. And I think that's something that we really want to see strengthened through this election season.
You can read through the research Danny's been sharing with us today online, and it'll be the charity's website to keep an eye on for those resources about the general election, eauk.org. Danny Webster is Director of Advocacy at the Evangelical Alliance. Thank you for sharing this conversation with us.
Thank you.
My thanks also to Rachel Gillis, who produced this episode of UCB's Life Issues podcast. Do make sure you subscribe to the series, and thank you too for listening today.